Don't believe the hype. Read the type. This is TYPBST.
Take a look, it's in a book. It's TYPBST, baby.
Yo, man, I feel like it's been a little while since you've sung that intro.
Yeah, man, it's been a while, but we back with another TYPBST episode.
Yeah, this one, I think a few people are going to be interested in this one, bro.
Well, I hope they're interested in all of them, but yeah, this is I think this is a timely read. It's How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. And basically what I did was, after reading it, there was a lot of layers to it. Oh, by the way, for those of you who don't know, How to Be an Anti-Racist is a New York Times bestseller, especially when the George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery fiascos hit. Those books were flying off the shelves. And so this was, this was a book that everybody was reading. And in light of it being Black History Month, also, you know, a lot of companies, a lot of businesses, a lot of agencies have been implementing anti-racist training and counseling for their staff. And so I thought we would take a deeper look into it. And so what I decided to do with this one is I decided to write a blog post and focus on one aspect of the book, because there's just so many layers to it in a good way. Like, there's so many layers in a good way. Like, there's so many angles you can take on it, because it's very, and this is kudos to Ibram, that there's a lot of layers in that it's comprehensive, in that his ideas touch every sphere of life. How to be an anti-racist really is how to be an anti-racist, and I would add, in every sphere of life. And so he does that. And so what I tried to do was, in light of me, and I mentioned this in my blog post, which is called Antiracism is Anti-Abolitionism. And I'll get to why I titled it that in a few. But as I was saying, I think that this is a necessary work, and that we should be analyzing it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's had significant influence, maybe is the right word. And so it's worthy of evaluation.
Yeah. And also, like, I took the time to read blogs, watch vlogs, as I mentioned in my paper. And so as I was like, because, you know, everybody has an opinion on it. And so I tried to, like, say, okay, well, I want to try to add something to the conversation. I really did. And so that's what we're going to do. I'm going to try to add something to the conversation on how to be an anti-racist. So without further ado,
how do you do?
Where are we gonna go? Where are we gonna go first, Joel? After, because you've read it. When this episode comes out, it'll be in circulation. You can find it on my blog. But what did you think of the blog first, Joel? What was your opinion?
Well, I mean, I like, assuming, you know, I have a director's cut that makes it to the final publishing. I like sort of the theme you've created with your headings. Just nice little layout. So I'll leave it at that, just in case you change them. But
no, we can. No, okay. I think
you're set. It's ready to publish. Yeah. I mean, yeah. No, I mean, so you essentially 5 headings that will summarize sort of the conversation we're going to have. Although some of them are a little more cryptic, but so antithesis or antithesis, anti-competitive, anti-black, anti-social, and antibiotic. are the 5 headings of your article or your blog post. I like it. I think it's a good summary. That and I think it's a nice little. Well, I don't. Pun's not the right word, but nice little play on words with regards to the title of the book. So I think something that we talked about way back on the episode about 6 types of Canadians was, I don't know if we went specifically to this definition, but an idea of, changing of words. And to be honest, maybe this was our prep conversation that I'm thinking of, because I'm slightly having deja vu to, I know where I was when we had this conversation, but we were, the idea that if I took a particular word and I'm like, okay, yeah, no issues, right? The definition makes sense to me, right? Being, and in this case, the word that comes to mind is the idea of like anti-racist. Well, in the inherent meaning of it, well, who's against racism, but that idea of being opposed to racism is not encompassing of what this term is really used for. And I think, you started out by pointing that out, but you took it a little bit further than that. So I think you have a really, really good, strong point there. So I'll sort of set you up to deliver it. But I think maybe just speak to why you thought defining terms was so important.
Oh, sorry. Could I just touch on the title real quick?
Yeah. No.
Yeah, so the title is called Anti-Racism is Anti-Abolitionism, and Anti-Abolitionism is owed to those who were against the ending of slavery. So abolitionists are those who were for the ending of slavery, and anti-abolitionists are those who were against blacks being free. And so the angle that I wanted to take, because like I said before, there was a lot of layers to the book, and that the work of Ibram is comprehensive and that it touches every sphere of life. So the sphere that the lane that I wanted to focus on was economics, mainly the idea of capitalism.
Yeah, he's pretty anti-capitalist as a person as well as in the book. Like, I mean, if you look at his social media, you look at most of his content, he's very much, I would call him a Marxist. But
oh man, what you gonna calling names?
I mean,
calling people names.
He has tendencies that in terms of his, proclivities of solutions that are, equality of outcome as opposed to equality of opportunity. So I think your point is valid that looking at the economics angle is something that maybe most people don't look at. And I think that's what's really insightful about your article. And when we get into that, the latter sections, I think hopefully the listener will think so as well. So coming back to what I had set you up on before you went into about sort of why you thought it was important to define terms, especially, provide a couple definitions or dictionary definitions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought it was important because it's confusing. The topic is confusing because who doesn't want to be against racism, right? Because it sounds like, okay, well, anti-racism is a good thing. And I've heard some bloggers, those who don't agree with Kendi, and they use the term Trojan, like a Trojan horse term. They use they're like, oh, this is a Trojan horse term, right? Like in the movie Troy, where the Trojan horse is brought in, and like the enemies were hiding inside the horse, and then it was like a gift sent to the people. And people, oh wow, it's a big old horsey. And then they brought the horse in their gates, and then everybody went to sleep. And then the bad guys jumped out of the Trojan horse and killed everybody in their sleep. And so that's a term people are like, oh, yo, anti-racism is a Trojan horse term. And yeah. And so with that said, it's important to unpack the definition and bring clarity, because it's kind of confusing, because yes, anti-racism, who isn't against it? But I was looking at the work of Neil Shenvi. Is that how you pronounce his name?
That sounds
Neil
right.
Yeah, Neil Shenvi. And Shenvi, yeah. So and he's an expert on critical theory, in which anti-racism flows out of. And on his website, and I'll have a link to it in my blog. And so he just gives a definition of racism and then a definition of anti-racism. So definition of racism is opposition to racism. So that's being against racism. So like I'm non-racist, so I'm against racism. And then anti-racism, the definition is, according to Kendi, is that a commitment to actively dismantling systems and institutions that produce racism.
And
what's wrong with that?
I mean, it's, this is what I was saying, sort of. So the previous conversation that I think again, I'm not sure if we touched on the podcast, but I know we talked about it in our, prep conversation. It's like, you take the word systemic and racism and the dictionary definitions of those words, okay, yeah, I know what you're talking about. But then when people start talking, sometimes the term systemic racism is used as more colloquial than strict definition. So they start using it in a vaguer sense than what the strict definition of the word would be. And that's where, anti-racist, how is that any different than being opposed to racism? Like on a strict definition sense.
Mm-hmm. So like in the book, he uses the definition of a racist as one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction or expressing a racist idea. And then an anti-racist, one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. So the point is like racist ideas always lead to racist actions.
And so this is where the Marxist piece comes into me, right? Like, so the definition, racism generally speaking will result in unequal outcome. The problem is that we're sort of we're applying a logical fallacy where unequal outcome is the result of racism. And so, commitment to actively dismantling systems and institutions that produce racism. Well, do you mean that produce unequal outcomes by race? Is that what, that's where this definition of anti-racism gets muddied? Because if you said your anti-racism is commitment to actively dismantling policies that are racist, and I just use policies as a more encompassing word, then you're sort of morphing anti-racism into being something a little bit more, but technically you're still sticking to the idea without sort of muddying the waters. But produce racism, like Joe Boot talked about this, right? He said systems will perpetuate what already exists, right? So if you have a racist society, arguably the system that that the society lives in produces racism as well, but the system is unrelated to the actual racist outcome or the racist actions being occurring. And I say unrelated because with or without them, they're not a contributing factor is sort of my point. And so again, the definitions it's meaningful because if I can't hold on to that definition, if it's hard to work with or evaluate, then I'm, how do I have a conversation about these things? right? So, I mean, even the definition you've read, it's sort of like, okay, that's vague. Like, what does produce racism mean?
Well,
I don't know. What are your,
no, I would answer that produce racism is disparity.
and that's sort of why I said unequal outcome, because if you're saying so actively dismantling systems or institutions that produce disparities, we need to have a more fundamental conversation about disparities and their origins.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, because he says racist policy is more tangible, and so he likes using the term racist policy because it's more tangible and exacting and more likely to be immediately understood by people, including its victims, who may not have the benefit of extensive fluency in racial terms. Racist policy says exactly what the problem is and where the problem is. Institutional racism and structural racism and systemic racism are redundant. Racism itself is institutional, structural, and systemic. So the idea of a racist policy is more of an exact term than using the term institutional racism, structural racism, or systemic racism. Like he said, though, those terms are redundant, and he would even say like they're somewhat vague and don't really hit the issue. And so he's saying, okay, look, my work is bringing something more nuanced to the table and looking at racist policy. And it's funny because pointing back, and maybe we should put it in the show notes, pointing back to our episode on Canada's racist policies.
yeah,
And well, we talked about this already. We have racist policies, and we talked about it. So, when you guys get some free time, check it out.
Yeah, and that's the episode I've been referring to, right? So same episode, and that is, I would agree. I like the term, or I like the concept of focusing on racist policies. But I think, at least for me, what I would define a racist policy and what he would define a racist policy would be different. I mean, the way I think I defined it on that show, I'm not 100% sure, but I think I defined it on that show, would be that any policy that makes a decision based on race when race is an irrelevant factor, that to me is a racist policy. Now, he would say a racist policy is one, I don't know if this is, there is a quote, I'm pulling it off actually, of Sam Say Slow to Write article, How to Be a Racist. One who is supporting a racist is one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inactions, through their action or inaction, or expressing a racist idea. But again, you go back to what you sort of have identified, that he's using racism as racial, or sort of vaguely referring to racial disparities as well. And so if he's defining a racist policy to be one that creates racial disparities, I say there's a more fundamental question that needs to be asked of what is the cause of the disparity? I said it previously already in this conversation. I do agree that racism will produce a disparity, but that doesn't mean all racial disparities are the result of racism.
Sorry,
right?
What do you mean by that?
So there's a logical fallacy called confirming the consequence. So it's like if A then B is the logical premise. So racism, A, produces unequal outcome. That's the B. B, therefore A, is the logical fallacy. So unequal outcome, it's called confirming the consequence. B is the consequence in the logical statement. If A, then B. B is the consequence. So if I confirm B, unequal outcome, you cannot, it's a logical fallacy to assume that it's due to racism. Because although racism does produce disparities, I think we can all agree there are numbers of factors that produce disparities. And free will is a big factor. Preferences is a big factor. Intelligence is a big factor. Among other things. And not to say that we should just ignore the disparity. But again, for me, it's, are we oversimplifying the problem because we're not willing to do the hard work? It goes back to even one of our first episodes where we talked about the Black Experience Project. And my question was like, okay, let's keep digging into the data, right? Let's go deeper. So, anyways, but I know I'm, harping on the point a bit, but I think it's good to understand the definitions as he uses them, and to say, if you just concede the terms, potentially if you're getting into a conversation or dispute with somebody and you're willing to concede the terms, you've already lost, because the problem is the terminology they're using is conflating of terms, or potentially where the real dispute lies. But you can't get there because you've conceded terminology to the other side or to your opposition, when that's really where you disagree. So I don't know, that to me is when I see most of this content. I mean, it's the same thing with systemic racism. If we're going to start expanding the definition of a term, the problem becomes we can't have a structured conversation, because I don't really know what people are referring to when the terms they use have multiple meanings, and those meanings are harder to nail down.
Mm-hmm. And we got into this conversation in our Is BLM Sin when Phil came on the show, and we were talking about the disparity being as a sign of racism.
Mm-hmm.
Put that in the show notes.
Oh yeah, I mean it's crazy to think that episode was almost a year ago. So, I think you in this section, I know we got to move on, but I think you narrow down, this idea of a primary source and secondary source. And I think, it's important for the listener to maybe understand why you thought it, like, why did you think it was necessary to dig into that piece a bit?
Into the
secondary and primary sources.
Okay, yeah. So the idea of primary secondary source was important because the argument I was making was that, pointing out the error that Kendi was making, is that he does a poor job. He's a terrible historian. So his historiography is terrible. Historiography is the study of historical writing. And so studying the artifacts. So looking at primary sources in light of the secondary sources. And so I make the argument that he flips it, actually. That's the problem. He flips it. He makes the secondary primary and the primary secondary. And I explain why in the paper. But yeah, the breakdown is basically the primary source is like the eyewitness account, and the documentation comes in the form of artwork, diary, letters. And the reason why primary sources are important is because they give us an honest account of history, right? So they're free from the pressure of political correctness. And then the secondary source is one step removed from the primary source. So this is where people use the primary source to inform their opinions or study them. So they give their own interpretation of the events based on the primary source. And this is very important to note, that there's a way that a person can give commentary on a primary source in a way that's biased, intentionally doing so and aware of their biases and being able to point it out. And then there's a way to give commentary that is not biased. And the way to, and this comes, and, for Christians who are listening, we know what that is. That's exegesis, right? Exegesis comes from the science of literature, which is called hermeneutics. And so, as Christians, We are a people of the book. We have a book of, it's not just a book of history, the Bible, but it's not just a book of theology, but it's also a history book. And we study history every day. If you're reading your Bible every day, and it's a historical account, and we're handling a primary source. And then when we go to our commentaries, there's some of them are secondary sources. And so we're really good at knowing how to handle and interpret historical texts. And this is where exegesis comes in. You have exegesis and you have eisegesis. Eisegesis is reading your opinions into the text, and exegesis is having the text speak for itself and letting it speak for itself. And so there is, the basic idea is that, you could put your opinion into the text, or you can let the text speak for itself. And that's the difference between putting your the subjective and the objective interpretation of a text. And so Kendi drops the ball on that in his inability, or not, I don't say inability, but I guess he hasn't taken the time to look at the primary sources on capitalism as written and documented by those who he's claiming to be against and trying to stop.
Yeah, and that's really getting into your antisocial section of your article.
Well, the next point was anti-competitive.
Yeah, no, I just meant what the point you just made relates to what you break down a little bit further.
Okay, yes,
sorry. Yeah. Sorry. So we'll come to that in a sec. In terms of the anti-competitive, I've sort of already spoke to this a little bit, but he does become very explicitly anti-capitalist. You've got a quote that I find very interesting. So it's from page 60 of his book. It says, "I keep using the term anti-capitalist as opposed to socialist or communist to include people who publicly or privately question or loathe capitalism, but do not identify as socialist or communist." To me, this just sounds like sketchy. And I just say that because it's or deceptive. I want to use a term that maybe people will be softer to, even though I'm really a socialist. Now, maybe I'm that's probably not a fair classification. He would argue, no, I'm trying to do it for those who are inherently anti-socialist, but maybe don't realize they really shouldn't be. But it's slippery because you're creating up a new term. Anti-capitalist. Okay, what do you mean by that? Right? So it sort of allows this idea of he's able to create terms as we go along, as opposed to using, predetermined or just strict definitions. That I don't know. Just it becomes harder to argue when you're creating new terms, because now everyone sort of has to get orientated as to what you're actually saying. So why did you think it was so important to highlight this anti-capitalist component of his book and character?
I think it's important because when I think of economics, I think of the science of making choices, the reallocation of scarce resources. And so the science of economics is, if you have a sound understanding of it, it can help economic mobility. That's why it's important to get the math right, so to speak. And so whether you're capitalist or socialist or whatever sphere you fall on, sound economics should lead to progress. And so that's the angle I was coming at it from. And as you'll see that I'm making the argument that capitalism has been helpful in helping Black people progress, as opposed to not. And that's the argument that Kendi is making.
Yeah, he's essentially making the argument that slave owners are capitalists.
Yes. So he makes the argument that racism and capitalism are twins, are conjoined twins, two sides of the same coin, so to speak. And so the reason why Black the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade happened is because of capitalism. The reason why, and so,
those are his positions.
But and as I say in the paper, but that's a common position though, in the Black community. It's common to associate capitalism with racism and the slave trade.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I'd have to go digging to find a link for this, but I think even it might be Bob Murphy has written an article that sort of hypothesizes that actually slavery made us worse off in the long run. Like, it's not that slavery created any sort of prosperity today. It's actually that because you lacked property rights and because people had the inability to allocate their own resources where they deemed the most appropriate, you're actually hindering the long-term productivity of society. Now, that would go so antithetical to so many arguments about slavery, whether that's reparations or other arguments. But I think it's important to understand that it's not, the only reason I bring it up is to demonstrate that it's not that simple. Right? You can't just, well, because someone exploited someone else, therefore, they were capitalists and somehow, capitalism is to blame. In from a free market perspective, the lack of free market that slaves had to allocate their own labor actually hinders society. And to go along with that, the amount of costs needed to enforce slaves, being someone else's property when you have, people running away, those are just wasted costs on society. So I only bring it up just to say, in line with what you've said, that like, oh, this argument is common, that slavery and capitalism kind of go hand in hand. There are good, and that's a strong economics based argument that he makes to show, if we were looking at economics from a both sort of theoretical perspective, as well as sort of, economic, if we try to do some economic calculations, we can show that, it actually didn't result in a net benefit for society as a whole. So now, would you say that his sort of anti-capitalist classification of capitalist classification of slave owners is due to the secondary primary source issue?
Oh yes, yeah, most definitely, and yeah, I would definitely say that because, like, and I give three main points of three anti-abolitionists, three slave owners, prominent slave owners who wrote on this issue and debated this issue, and they were basically saying that they were anti-capitalist, and these guys were it was John C. Calhoun, 1782 to 1850, and then George Fitzhugh, 1806 to 1881, and James Henry Hammond, 1807 to 1864. And I use three of these guys, and I go to their work, and I'm reading their work, and they're making arguments on why slaves shouldn't be free. And the argument they're using on why slaves shouldn't be free is because capitalism is terrible. It's worse. It's better off for blacks to be slaves than for them to be in a quote unquote capitalistic economy. And it's funny because when you read it, you're like, oh wow, like these guys are really making arguments why it's better for a slave to be under free labor than paid labor. And so these guys are making arguments why why slave, and it's twisted, but the arguments they're using, and they're arguments we use today. It's stuff we hear today, and that's the scary part, where we're like, okay, well, if they're against anti-racism, or if they're against anti-capitalism and you're against anti-capitalism, then sorry, I thought you were against these guys. So why are you peddling the same economic principles as slaveholders?
Yeah, it's I mean, I think that's where you're shining some good light into this conversation.
Right. And then on the flip side, I show the abolitionists, and I just mentioned some abolitionists who were for the free market, right? So think about it. If anti-abolitionists are using these arguments to keep blacks enslaved, what kind of arguments do you think the abolitionists are using? Think about it, right? Part of, understanding history is, putting history in its context. If these white racist people are saying, let's keep blacks enslaved because capitalism is bad for them, what kind of arguments do you think the abolitionists are making? And so I name dropped a couple guys. I name dropped Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, Alodu Equiano. These are men that Equiano bought his own freedom, and he had his own slave narrative that did really well, and he documents his time in slavery. And he said that prior to him being bought into slavery, he was already a slave in Africa, and he documents that in great detail in him being a slave in Africa before he became a slave under whites. Right. And then him talking, and now since he bought his freedom, now he's fighting for the freedom of blacks. And he works along William Wilberforce in the Clapham sect in England to abolish slavery in England. And then you have Booker T. Washington, who once he's free, he creates the Tuskegee Institute. Now, I don't talk about this in the paper, but so I'm just giving you some context. But you have Booker T. Washington talking about, okay, now we're free. What are we going to do? Well, I'm going to create the Tuskegee Institute, which is an institute that is going to teach black people skills, like trade skills, so that they can have skills to contribute to the economy, so that they would be able to create wealth and a living for themselves, these are free market principles. Also, Frederick Douglass, one of his speeches, he says, what shall we do? White people are saying, what shall we do with the Negro now that he's free? What shall we do with the Negro now that he's free? Right? Well, today, what would they say? What shall we do with the Negro? What would people say today if they're listening? Frederick Douglass asked that question. They're going to say, okay, well, we should help them. We should, create programs for them and come alongside them. Well, Frederick Douglass says, do nothing with us. Do nothing with us. Let us stand on our own feet. Right? Right? So these are guys who are at odds with the anti-abolitionists. And so these are the arguments. These are the contextual historical arguments about what economic ideas are helpful for black people and which ones aren't. And then I show people today. Sorry, you're going to say something?
I was just going to say, yeah, it's good to point out, because like you would think, okay, whatever the economic ideas of those who wanted to maintain slavery, we should be considering, chances are we don't want those ones. And those who are against slavery, what are the economic ideas that they're promoting? Right? Like it's worthy of consideration. And this is where, I always make I'd make this claim against Kendi that, are you being objective? Right? Are you looking for a narrative? Are you looking to prove your point? Or are you looking to be objective and evaluating? Because, from the way he's presented it is like, well, secondary sources, you've got it twisted. Right? You haven't dug in and tried to say, okay, let's present both ideas and weigh them against each other and see, why would one group hold one and why would the other hold the other, and evaluate them, with an honest sort of, no, he's clearly presenting one portion of the entire, conversation in order to reiterate his own point.
But I would say that's for good reason. He does that for good reason. And the reason, and so I say in the post, I say, sadly, in the Black community, capitalism is blamed for the transatlantic slave trade. I believe this is due to trusting the secondary sources of Black people over the primary sources of white people. Who can blame us? Can you blame us for doing that? No, you can't. You can't. And I agree with Kendi on that. This is why most Black people are like, well, you can't trust white people. You can't, right? In order for you to survive and to push along, you can't trust white work. You can't trust white history. So the secondary sources, right? Because, people will say, okay, history is written by the victors. And so for Black thinkers, current Black thinkers are saying, okay, well, we're thinking and we're going to speak for our people. You no longer speak for our people. So we're going to speak for our people. And so whatever we see from these primary sources from white people, we're not going to rock with it. We're going to come with our own ideas. And some of these ideas have manifested itself in Pan-Africanism. Now, I don't talk about Pan-Africanism in the post because it's not good to add new ideas, too many ideas to a thought. But just to add context, so Pan-Africanist ideas, Pan-Africanism is a worldwide movement that aims to encourage and strengthen bonds of solidarity between all indigenous and diaspora ethnic groups of African descent. So what that means is that for those people who were descendants who came to the Americas from Africa are part of the diaspora. And so the idea is to unite all Black people from the diaspora and back to the motherland as one people, as one unit, to support each other spiritually and also materially. So it's also like an economic principle. It embodies economic principles. So this is something I grew up hearing. This is something that's normal. It's a normal narrative of the Black experience. And so this is where Kendi is coming from, and many people who are anti-capitalists are coming from.
So for the listener, does that sort of lead into the last couple sections, or is there like for your article, if they're coming to it, I think it's a very it sort of flows, it builds upon itself. But is there any sort of abrupt change that they need to be aware of? I mean, obviously you went on a bit of a rabbit trail that you didn't bring into the post, but bringing it back to your blog, what are you really trying to drive home as we get to the last couple sections for the listener to take in?
I just wanted them to look at history and take it seriously. You heard the term armchair historian. Armchair meaning it comes from the term armchair quarterback. So the armchair quarterback is the guy who watches football and is lazy boy, and he's criticizing the quarterback. He's like, look at this guy, man. He was in the pocket and he couldn't get out, and he couldn't make the pass. So it's the same thing with the armchair historian or armchair theologian, armchair economist. You got people who sit in their armchair and make commentaries about history and don't know how to do it. And just like any other discipline, you have to respect it because those people put in work. Economics is a discipline. Like people who are economists put in work. Shout out to Stefan, new style, didn't dial. It's real. Like if you talk to Steph, this is not This is not a play thing. Theologians, pastors who study their Hebrew and Greek, it takes work. Same thing with history. It takes work. It's not enough to just sit back and say, okay, you're using the rubric of too male, too stale, and too pale, right? Too male meaning too male, too masculine, right? Okay, so we can't use that. Too stale, right? Too old, right? You can't use that. Too pale. It's too white, right? That's your framework, right? So we can't rock with that material. That's not faithful. That's not academic integrity. And so you have to get back to the basics. And so I try to teach the lesson of, primary sources and secondary sources, and that you're not majoring in the minors and minoring in the majors, right? You got to put everything in priority. And Kendi gets his priorities backwards. And as much as he's trying to help Black people, if he's peddling ideas of anti-abolitionists, then actually his work is being counterproductive to the economic mobility of Black people. And so my last point is that, so I said this, his lack of knowledge of how to do historiography, the study of historical writing, has made his work contradictory. It's because of the free market he's able to have the #1 selling book in America, and is now the director of the Center of Anti-Racist Research at Boston University. In the same vein, if proponents of anti-racism aren't careful, they will repeat history in promoting the economic values of enslavers who thought they were helping Black people, but in reality, we're actually hurting them.
So, for the listener who thinks you're blowing it out of proportion with that statement, how can you hit it home a little bit more for them, right? Because what you're saying is that, the ideas he's promoting will actually result in the complete opposite impact than what he's claiming. I would take the claim it's from economic ignorance. I think you would agree that that would be the reason why he's getting there. But I think there's also, you've already made this point, and I'll just reiterate it. It sounds like you would also say he's has historical ignorance in terms of making that point. So tell me if I'm wrong there, and then maybe unpack that a little bit more for the listener who thinks, okay, you're being a little over the top here. Like, he might be wrong in his ideas, but he's not going to promote values that enslave.
Right. But see, this is why, economics is so valuable, because it's these principles that either promote progress or regress. And I give a definition, and we didn't touch on it, but it's important to define what these terms are. And I tried to be as gracious and not straw man the opposition. And so I gave a definition of capitalism, and I basically said, like, there's pros and cons, and I'm not saying, like, capitalism's perfect. I'm saying that there's pros and cons with capitalism, and there's pros and cons with socialism. But the idea is looking at the two and comparing the two and the pros and cons of the two. And then when you compare the pros and cons of the two, the cost benefit analysis of capitalism and the free market would outweigh what socialism is, and actually freedom. And thank God for it. Freedom had prevailed. Black people were set free. And I guess that's what kind of always got me as a historian, like even as a little kid, hearing about Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. And the first thing as a little kid, the first thing that popped into my mind is, what kind of political context and historical or economic context do these kind of ideas, do these things happen? What kind of economic, political climate brings about freedom of Black people, right? So these are the questions we have to ask and look at. And so, and the answer is, well, it's free market principles. And so I get into the definition of these things. And I think that one of the aspects under Anti-Black, the title that I have in the paper, Anti-Black, I think, I always use the term other brothers. And there's always this one-sided narrative of that, Black people think this way and Black people are, all believe this thing. But, there are other brothers who don't believe the, anti-capitalism or capitalism is racism narrative. And then I name dropped a couple people like the great female economist Dambisa Moyo. And then I referenced the late Walter Williams, Shelby Steele, Glenn Lowry, Thomas Sowell. And these are Black people that smart, intellectual Black people that bring arguments against it. And I think that at this point you have to wrestle with the ideas. You can't just write them off and say, okay, well, that's your white privilege talking, or your Uncle Ruckus. You guys don't know Uncle Ruckus. Mm-hmm. Uncle Ruckus is this guy in the Boondocks cartoons, and he's a Black guy. He hates Black people. And so in the cartoon, he's a Black guy, and he to his bone, in his heart, he hates Black people. And it's funny. It's supposed to be funny because there's just ways he just hates Black people, and he just says things that's so mean towards Black people. And he hates himself as a Black person, and he wishes he was white. And it's supposed to be funny, but anyways, the term Uncle Ruckus gets thrown around. But I'm just saying, like, if we're really honest in trying to help people, and again, this isn't about, calling people names or whatever the case may be, put that aside, whether it's somebody who's a cultural Marxist or social justician or social justice warrior or a coon or Uncle Tom, like squash all that. Let's just do the math. Let's just sit down and do the math. That's all, right? And assuming that both sides want to help Black people, sit down and do the math. Assuming both sides love Black people. I love Black people. I want to see Black people succeed. And so I don't want to push ideas that are going to hurt them. And so for me, looking at the math and looking at the principles and hearing both sides of the argument, well, no, clearly one side is better than the other. But I hope that answers your question in regards to me being too heavy-handed or being not fair to what Kendi is doing.
No, I mean, I think you were, I think you were fair. Obviously, I'm just sort of anticipating objections. And there's a quote from Sam Say's article that I'll put in the show notes page too, that I think, sort of demonstrates a little bit of Kendi's approach. And this is where I'll end. I'll sort of leverage Sam Say. Because, your point is so valid about those that, whatever the community is, right? If you want to see the betterment of a given community, you got to do the work to figure out the cause and effect relationships that are causing, negative outcomes. And be willing that what your preconceived notions are might be wrong. And I'll assume Kendi is very convinced in his position. But many people that are, let's say, more left-leaning, not all, but many people on the left are motivated by the objectives are morally good. So their objectives are morally good, therefore you can't argue with it. Or, therefore, I'm going to do everything to get people on my side. And the willingness to say, maybe my ideas, although motivated well, aren't good, is a little bit tougher. And I think it's demonstrated in his approach to the book. So this is Sam Say, a quote that I really liked in his article. So, and the book is part memoir, part manifesto. The storytelling aspect of the book is an intentional and crucial approach for Kendi. Critical race theorists use storytelling to demonstrate their standpoint epistemology, a theory meaning an oppressed person's experiences give them expertise or special insight into ending injustice. That is why throughout the book, Kendi delivers various forms of supposed racism and anti-racism only after describing his experiences. By describing his truth, he gives him authority to define truth. Therefore, chapter by chapter, Kendi describes and defines biological, ethical, ethnic, bodily, cultural, behavioral, class, gender, queer, and space racism. And the reason I thought it was good to read that and summarize it is that, the word manifesto, this is like, he's trying to rally people behind his approach to solving the problems by appealing to your emotion, by appealing to, he tells you a story that befriends you and gets you on his side to then tell you what he thinks is true. There's an aspect of approach and tactic here. And not to say that, obviously my approach would be like very methodical and numerical and showing that, this approach would produce the best results. But I'm not saying that my approach is better, but to some extent, the way Sam sort of summarized it, it's very, very difficult to disagree in a manner that says, here's why you're wrong, when everything is sort of based on, as he put it, standpoint epistemology, because that approach says, well, you can't argue with me because my experience is my truth. And it's sort of, it hinders the idea that while objective truth may be hard to observe, it doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue it. And that's where I would definitely stand. I think that's where you stand, is that, we want to find the best solution, not the solution that is, has the best motivations, to solve problems like.
Yeah. And I would, say that lived experience, is king. And right. So yeah. And I think world. That, it's kind of funny because, so when I walk into a room full of white people, I'm king. Why? Because I have a lived experience, right? I've been surrounded by police, just being in a neighborhood and 4 squad cars come and surround me. I've been searched outside of a Shoppers Drug Mart. I've been arrested and detained because I fit the description of somebody that was part of a shooting the night before. I've been escorted outside of bars because a white girl said I made a pass at her and now they're kicking me out the bar. I've been humiliated because I'm black. I've been stopped by the police numerous times. Why? Because they care about my safety and they're checking in on me. I have the lived experience. I have the proof. I have the scars. Right? So I could walk into the room and be an authority. The only difference is my conclusion isn't the same as Kendi's. And so this is why I use the term other brothers. And so it's important that as much as, we say, oh, well, the left is dominating and this and this and that, we have to use the weapons of the age and the context that is calling the fight for. If they're going to give black people, all black people a platform, well, then, help spread my ideas, Sam's ideas, Daryl Harrison's ideas. Right? You see what I'm saying? And again, like I understand, it's important to be gracious and humble and kind. And I will buy you a coffee. I'll buy you a slice of pizza and we could break bread. But I'll let you guys know straight up, I was born in the 80s. That means that I don't run from no one, right? If I say something, I stand by it and you can find me, right? I come from a time where if you were the toughest kid in the playground, you had to prove it. If you were the fastest kid in the playground, you had to prove it. If you're the best rapper, you have to prove it. If you're the best ball player, you have to prove it. I'm saying my ideas are right. they're correct. And I could prove it. You could find me. I will not run. You could hit me up. You could email me, message me. I will not run. Come talk to me and I will listen. Because the idea, there's no merit in me being right. No merit in me being right. I get nothing. What's the point of being right and black people are struggling and suffering? Who cares? Who cares? The goal is to encourage, build up, edify, mobilize people that are struggling, especially, those in the black community that are struggling. That's what I care about. I don't care about being right. I don't have a horse in the race, so to speak. But I'm saying that because of lived experience and that's king, I'm saying share the blog post, share the episode, especially among Christians. You can't call me a coon because I'm your brother. You can't call me Uncle Ruckus because I love black people and I love being black. But I think it's time for a change to start pushing ideas that are counter to the narrative of black people think this way. All black people are anti-capitalist. All black people are X, right? There's different thoughts. There's different thinkers. There's different ways that black people have approached things. And I want to represent that and help bring real change. Like I said, you can find me. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram under Do Good at Darnell, DOGUDDA_Darnell. The Do Good stands for actually doing good. And Darnell Sam are trying. No, man, we getting the job done, man. As my coach Alvin used to say when I was a kid, he used to say, "Don't try, do."
Or trying.
Don't try, do. So that's what we're here to do. We're here to be do-gooders and do good and encourage people and build up black people and create some kind of unity between all cultures.
True.
You can find me also on Facebook, Darnell Samuels. Check out my blog, High End Theories. Let me know what you think. I will not run. Come see me. Holla back.
Yeah, so I'll have lots of Darnell stuff on our his article, a bunch of links for the show. And I think your point that, we don't aim to be right? Like the point of this podcast isn't necessarily to espouse our ideas because we think they're the best. We have our particular positions because we think we've come to the conclusion that they are right. But I think for both of us, we're willing to have our minds changed. And I think that's something that's not that common today. Many people want to push their ideas, and they want to be right as opposed to they want to engage in conversation. So when Darnell says, reach out to us, it applies to both of us, regardless of the, any position we hold. We want to engage with the things that challenge our positions, the ideas that have to be reconciled, or positions or experiences that don't match up with our positions. We want to wrestle through them because it helps us to know our own position better and maybe even change if we're incorrect. So reach out to me, TJoelN39 on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And then you can hit us up on Facebook and Twitter for Six Cents Report at Six Cents Report. Or email us sixcentsreport@gmail.com, especially if you want to get on the show and maybe try and put Darnell in his place on this one.
And don't believe the hype, read the type.
But you heard me? Does that make sense?